Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to reveal to you is going to absolutely infuriate you, it's going to make you question the integrity of WWE management, and it's going to change the entire landscape of SmackDown as we know it. Before I break down the most controversial decision in recent WWE history, before I expose every detail of the absolute injustice that occurred on SmackDown when Nick Aldis made a choice that has the entire wrestling world in an uproar, I need you to stop what you're doing right now and smash that like button, hit subscribe like your career depends on it, and drop a comment telling me if you think Nick Aldis has lost his mind or if Paul Heyman somehow deserved what happened to him. Because what went down on SmackDown wasn't just a firing, it was a public execution of one of the greatest minds in professional wrestling history, and you need to hear every single word of what transpired when the general manager decided to end Paul Heyman's career in the most humiliating way possible. The show started like any other Friday night. SmackDown was rolling along with solid matches, good promos, and the usual mix of storyline development that fans have come to expect. Paul Heyman had been advertised to appear, which always guarantees ratings because even after decades in the business, the wise man still commands attention whenever he picks up a microphone. For those who don't know the full scope of Paul Heyman's importance to professional wrestling, let me educate you real quick. This man has been a pivotal figure in the industry for over 30 years. He was the creative genius behind ECW, the promotion that revolutionized hardcore wrestling and gave opportunities to countless performers who would go on to become legends. He's been an advocate, a manager, a booker, a commentator, and a creative consultant for WWE. His relationship with Brock Lesnar created one of the most dominant runs in WWE history. His partnership with Roman Reigns transformed the Tribal Chief into an all-time great character and led to the longest championship reign of the modern era. Paul Heyman isn't just another personality on the WWE roster, he's an institution, a walking encyclopedia of wrestling knowledge, and someone who has proven time and time again that he can make anyone he's associated with into a bigger star. His promos are legendary, his ability to tell stories through words is unmatched, and his understanding of what makes wrestling compelling is second to none. So when Nick Aldis, who has been the SmackDown general manager for a relatively short period of time, decided to call Paul Heyman out to the ring on this particular Friday night, everyone assumed it was going to be a standard segment where Heyman would verbally spar with Aldis, maybe set up a storyline for one of his clients, and the show would move on. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Nick Aldis was standing in the center of the ring with a microphone and a very serious expression on his face. When Paul Heyman's music hit and he walked out onto that stage, the crowd gave him the usual warm reception because despite being aligned with heel characters throughout his career, fans respect Paul Heyman's contributions to the business. Heyman walked down that ramp with his usual confident swagger, his phone in one hand as always, ready to deliver whatever promo was needed for the segment. He stepped into the ring, and you could immediately sense something was off. Nick Aldis didn't have his usual diplomatic demeanor. He looked angry, he looked frustrated, and he looked like a man who had made a decision he was ready to execute regardless of the consequences. Aldis started talking, and his words were cutting from the very first sentence. He said that since becoming general manager of SmackDown, he's had to deal with constant manipulation, constant politicking, and constant interference from people who think they're above the rules. He said that Paul Heyman represents everything that's wrong with the backstage culture of WWE, a culture of favoritism, of backroom deals, of certain people getting preferential treatment while others get overlooked. The crowd was confused because this wasn't typical scripted WWE dialogue, this felt more personal, more real, more uncomfortable. Aldis continued, saying that Paul Heyman has been whispering in people's ears, undermining authority, and using his relationships with top stars to get his way regardless of what's best for SmackDown as a show. Paul Heyman tried to interject, tried to respond with his usual eloquent defense, but Nick Aldis cut him off immediately. Aldis said that he's tired of the games, tired of the manipulation, and tired of having to constantly deal with the chaos that Paul Heyman brings wherever he goes. Then Aldis said the words that made everyone's jaw drop. He said that effective immediately, Paul Heyman's services are no longer required on SmackDown. Paul Heyman is fired. Just like that, in front of a live audience, in front of millions watching at home, Nick Aldis terminated the employment of one of the most important figures in WWE history. The arena went silent for a moment, that kind of stunned silence where people can't quite process what they just heard. Then the reactions started building. Some people booed, angry at Nick Aldis for making such a drastic decision in such a public and humiliating way. Other people cheered, either because they genuinely disliked Paul Heyman's character or because they were reacting to the shock value of the moment. Paul Heyman's expression was priceless, a mixture of genuine surprise, anger, and something that looked like hurt. This is a man who has been insulted, attacked, and humiliated in storylines countless times, but this felt different. This felt like it cut deeper because it was an attack on his professional reputation, his legacy, his very identity in the wrestling business. Paul started to respond, and you could hear the emotion in his voice. He said that Nick Aldis has no idea what he's doing, no understanding of the history and importance of the role that Paul Heyman plays in WWE. He said that firing him isn't just a mistake, it's a catastrophic error in judgment that SmackDown will regret for years to come. Heyman talked about how he's been the advocate for champions, the special counsel for the tribal chief, the wise man who has guided careers to heights they never would have reached without his involvement. He asked Nick Aldis if he really thinks he has the authority to just erase decades of contributions with one announcement, if he really believes that SmackDown will be better off without the greatest manager and advocate in wrestling history. Nick Aldis wasn't moved by any of it. He stood there stone-faced and told Paul Heyman that he has 5 minutes to leave the building or security would escort him out forcibly. The disrespect was staggering. This wasn't a graceful exit, this wasn't a retirement celebration or a send-off befitting someone of Paul Heyman's stature. This was a firing conducted in the most degrading way possible, in front of everyone, with no ceremony, no acknowledgement of his accomplishments, just a cold termination followed by a threat of physical removal if he didn't comply immediately. Paul Heyman looked around the arena, maybe hoping for someone to come out and defend him, maybe waiting for a top star to intervene and tell Nick Aldis he's making a terrible mistake. But nobody came. The silence was deafening. Paul took one last look at Nick Aldis with an expression that mixed contempt with something that looked like betrayal, and then he slowly walked out of that ring. The crowd was reacting loudly now, chanting for Heyman, booing Nick Aldis, creating an atmosphere of chaos and confusion. As Paul walked up the ramp, cameras caught the look on his face, and it was heartbreaking to see someone who has given so much to this business being treated with such callous disregard. When he disappeared through the curtain, Nick Aldis grabbed the microphone again and said that SmackDown is entering a new era, an era where nobody is bigger than the show, where management makes decisions based on what's best for the brand rather than what's best for individuals, and where the days of special treatment and backstage politics are over. He said that anyone who doesn't like his methods or his decisions can join Paul Heyman in the unemployment line. The crowd booed him mercilessly, but Aldis didn't care. He had made his statement, flexed his authority, and fundamentally altered the power structure of Friday Night SmackDown in one devastating segment. Now let's break down exactly why this is so significant and why it has the potential to change everything about WWE going forward. First, we need to understand the relationship between on-screen authority figures and the actual power structure in WWE. General managers in WWE are characters, they're performers playing a role just like the wrestlers, and their authority only extends as far as the storylines allow. But sometimes, rarely, those lines get blurred in ways that create uncomfortable situations where you're not entirely sure what's real and what's scripted. This felt like one of those moments. The way Nick Aldis delivered those lines, the emotion in Paul Heyman's reaction, the lack of typical wrestling segment structure, it all contributed to a feeling that something genuine was happening beyond the usual scripted content. Paul Heyman's firing, if it's legitimate within the storyline, creates massive ripple effects throughout SmackDown and potentially the entire WWE landscape. Think about who Paul Heyman has been associated with recently. Roman Reigns as the tribal chief had Paul by his side for years during his historic championship run. That relationship was central to Roman's character development and the success of his title reign. Without Paul Heyman, what happens to Roman? Does he become less effective as a character? Does he need a new advocate or special counsel? Or does this force Roman to evolve as a character and stand on his own without Paul's verbal support? All of these questions create uncertainty, and that uncertainty can be good for storytelling if handled properly. Then there's the question of what happens to Paul Heyman himself. If he's been fired from SmackDown by Nick Aldis, does that mean he can appear on Raw? Can he show up on NXT? Is he completely banned from all WWE programming? The logistics of this firing within the storyline framework need to be addressed because Paul Heyman not being on WWE television is almost unthinkable. He's been a constant presence for so long that his absence would leave a significant void. And if he does show up somewhere else, how does Nick Aldis respond? Does he have the authority to enforce his decision across all brands, or is his power limited to SmackDown? These are the kinds of details that WWE creative needs to nail down to make this angle work long term. There's also the very real possibility that this is setting up a major storyline where Paul Heyman comes back with a vengeance. Maybe he aligns with someone who has a grudge against Nick Aldis or against the current SmackDown establishment. Maybe he recruits a group of disgruntled superstars who feel they've been mistreated by management and leads them in a campaign to make Nick Aldis's life miserable. Paul Heyman as a revolutionary figure fighting against authority would be compelling television because he has the credibility and the verbal skills to make that character work perfectly. His promos about being wrongfully terminated, about fighting for justice, about exposing the corruption of management, those would be absolute fire and would generate huge reactions. From Nick Aldis's perspective, this decision positions him as either a strong authority figure who won't tolerate manipulation in politics, or as a tyrant who abuses his power and makes emotional decisions without considering the consequences. Which interpretation is correct depends entirely on how WWE chooses to frame the situation going forward. If other characters on SmackDown start agreeing with Nick Aldis, saying that firing Paul Heyman was the right call and that SmackDown is better off without him, then WWE is positioning Aldis as a reformer cleaning house. But if characters start condemning the decision, questioning Aldis's judgment, and demanding Heyman's reinstatement, then WWE is positioning Aldis as a heel authority figure who needs to be opposed and eventually removed from power himself. The fan reaction to this has been overwhelmingly negative toward Nick Aldis, which suggests WWE wants him to be seen as the villain in this situation. Social media exploded with people defending Paul Heyman, talking about his contributions to the business, expressing disbelief that WWE would treat him this way even within a storyline. The hashtag #FireNickAldis was trending within an hour of the segment airing. Wrestling journalists and personalities were weighing in with their takes, most of them critical of how the situation was handled. This level of engagement is exactly what WWE wants because it means people care deeply about what happened and will tune in to see how the situation develops. Let's talk about the precedent this sets for how authority figures operate in WWE. We've seen evil general managers before, we've seen authority figures abuse their power and fire people unfairly, but those situations usually involved lower or mid-card talent, or they happened as part of a clearly defined storyline where everyone knew it was building toward a specific payoff. This situation with Paul Heyman feels different because of who Paul is and how the segment was structured. It wasn't presented as the beginning of an obvious angle, it was presented as a genuine management decision that happened to occur on camera. That ambiguity is both intriguing and potentially problematic because if WWE doesn't follow through with a satisfying resolution, fans will feel like their emotions were manipulated for no good reason. There's also the question of what this means for other managers and advocates in WWE. If Paul Heyman can be fired so unceremoniously, what's stopping Nick Aldis or any other authority figure from doing the same to other personalities? Does this create a sense of instability where no one's position is secure? Or is this specifically about Paul Heyman and the unique role he occupies within WWE? These are storytelling considerations that impact how the roster is perceived and how future angles can be constructed. WWE has to be careful not to create a situation where authority figures become so powerful that they overshadow the actual wrestlers and the in-ring competition. Let me address something that I know some of you are thinking right now. You're wondering if this is a work or if there's legitimate heat between Nick Aldis and Paul Heyman behind the scenes. That's always the question when something feels this personal and this uncomfortable. The truth is we probably won't know the full story for months or possibly years. What I can tell you is that both men are consummate professionals who understand how to work an audience and create compelling television. Whether there's real animosity between them or whether this is entirely scripted, the execution was effective because it got everyone talking and created genuine emotional reactions from the audience. If this is entirely a work, then it's brilliant because it feels authentic and creates investment in seeing how it resolves. If there are elements of reality mixed into the storyline, then it's dangerous but potentially even more compelling because of that authenticity. WWE has been experimenting more and more with blurring the lines between fiction and reality in their storytelling, and this segment fits perfectly into that approach. The key is making sure that the payoff justifies the setup and that fans feel satisfied with how the story concludes rather than feeling like their emotions were manipulated pointlessly. The historical context of authority figure storylines in WWE is worth examining because it helps us understand where this might be headed. The Mr. McMahon character, the evil boss who abused his power and made life miserable for Stone Cold Steve Austin, is probably the most successful authority figure storyline in WWE history. That worked because Vince McMahon was a legitimately powerful figure in the company, so his on-screen authority felt real, and because Stone Cold was the perfect rebellious hero to fight against that authority. If WWE is trying to recreate the dynamic with Nick Aldis as the authority figure and potentially Paul Heyman or someone Heyman aligns with as the rebel, they need to make sure all the pieces are in place for it to work. The authority storyline with Triple H and Stephanie McMahon is another example, though that one became increasingly criticized over the years for going on too long and making the authority figures feel more important than the actual wrestlers. WWE needs to avoid the trap with this Nick Aldis situation. The general manager should be a catalyst for stories involving the wrestlers, not the main focus of the show himself. If this Paul Heyman firing leads to compelling programs between wrestlers fighting over the injustice or fighting to support Nick Aldis's decision, then it serves its purpose. If it becomes all about Nick Aldis and his authority with the wrestlers as background players, then it will ultimately fail. What I find most intriguing about this whole situation is how it affects the perception of power in WWE. Nick Aldis walked into the general manager role with credibility as a former world champion in other promotions and as someone who commanded respect in the wrestling industry. But he's still relatively new to WWE and to this specific role. For him to make such a bold move as firing Paul Heyman, someone who has infinitely more history and influence within WWE, is either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Time will tell which one it actually is. If this decision leads to Nick Aldis successfully reshaping SmackDown into a better show with better storylines and happier performers, then history will view him as a strong leader who made a tough but necessary call. If it leads to chaos, decreased ratings, and locker room discontent, then he'll be viewed as someone who overstepped his authority and damaged the brand. The wrestling industry is a strange place where perceived reality matters as much as actual reality. Paul Heyman being fired on television creates a perception that he's vulnerable, that his position in WWE isn't as secure as everyone assumed. Even though we all know wrestling is scripted and this is likely part of a storyline, the visual of Paul Heyman being humiliated and forced to leave creates a mental association that's hard to shake. Some fans will genuinely worry about Paul's future with the company even though logically they know WWE wouldn't actually fire someone of his importance and value. That's the power of effective storytelling. It makes you feel things even when your rational mind knows it's fiction. Let's think about potential matches and programs that could come from this. If Paul Heyman recruits a wrestler to be his champion in fighting against Nick Aldis's authority, who would that wrestler be? It would need to be someone with credibility, someone who can cut promos well enough to hold their own alongside Heyman, and someone who benefits from having Paul as their advocate. A returning star or someone currently in the mid-card looking for the push to main event status would be perfect. Imagine Paul Heyman aligning with someone unexpected and turning them into a genuine threat to SmackDown's established order. The program writes itself, with that wrestler fighting Nick Aldis's chosen representatives, battling for the right to have Paul Heyman reinstated, building toward an ultimate confrontation where if they win, Heyman comes back, but if they lose, both the wrestler and Heyman are banned from SmackDown forever. Another possibility is that Roman Reigns, the tribal chief himself, takes issue with Nick Aldis firing his Wiseman. Even though Roman has been functioning without Paul recently, the disrespect shown to someone in Roman's inner circle could be viewed as disrespect to Roman himself. Roman could confront Nick Aldis, demand Paul's reinstatement, and when Aldis refuses, it creates a conflict where the biggest star on SmackDown is at odds with management. That dynamic has huge potential because Roman has the power and presence to make Nick Aldis look weak if he can't control the tribal chief. The political battle between the most dominant wrestler and the general manager would be fascinating to watch unfold. Or perhaps this leads to an even bigger angle where multiple authority figures get involved. Maybe WWE's corporate leadership steps in, maybe Adam Pearce from Raw has something to say about how a fellow general manager is handling his power, maybe Triple H as the head of creative intervenes if the situation gets out of hand. These layers of authority and power dynamics create complexity that can sustain a storyline for months if executed properly. Every week could bring new developments, new challenges, new twists that keep the audience engaged and guessing about what happens next. What absolutely cannot happen is for this to be dropped or ignored. If WWE does this massive angle where Paul Heyman gets fired in such a public and dramatic fashion, and then it just goes away without proper resolution, that would be a catastrophic failure of storytelling. The fans who invested emotionally in what happened deserve to see a payoff that justifies their investment. Paul Heyman needs to either get reinstated with Nick Aldis being forced to apologize and admit he was wrong, or Heyman needs to get revenge in some other form that feels satisfying and appropriate. Or if WWE really wants to go in a different direction, Paul could end up on Raw or NXT and thrive there, making Nick Aldis look foolish for letting such talent go. Any of those outcomes work, but doing nothing is not an option. I want to hear from everyone watching this video right now about how you think this situation should be resolved. Do you want to see Paul Heyman come back and make Nick Aldis's life miserable? Do you want to see Roman Reigns destroy Aldis for disrespecting the Wiseman? Do you think Paul should move to Raw and help build that brand instead? Or do you actually support Nick Aldis's decision and think SmackDown is better off without Paul Heyman's backstage politicking? Drop a comment immediately telling me your thoughts because this is the most controversial storyline happening in WWE right now and everyone has an opinion. Make sure you've smashed the like button if you found this breakdown valuable and insightful. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss my coverage as this story continues to develop week by week. Share this video with every wrestling fan you know because this is the conversation everyone needs to be having. Paul Heyman being fired by Nick Aldis on live television is either the beginning of something incredible or a massive mistake, and we're going to find out which one very soon. The Wiseman has been cast out, and the entire wrestling world is watching to see what happens next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we continue to follow this absolutely insane situation.